Okay, there were three big picture questions we were going to try to cover in 20 minutes. And also, we're going to have to take time for questions from the audience because usually at museum events, the audience has better questions than I do. So our big topics are, what are the risks involved with IoT? Should there be regulations in place? Who should be in charge? Whose responsibility? And how can consumers ensure their information is kept secure? These are numbers that you guys know, that various research firms say that 20 billion things will be connected by 2020. I think Cisco puts it at 50 billion. With these kind of numbers, Jeff, what do you see as the biggest security, or what is the biggest risk?
Classifying as the biggest is tough.
Or the ones that really you think about, keep you up at night.
I put them in buckets. There's physical risk, whether it is personal, the device you have at home, whether messing with your thermostat or some other connected device, water heater. There is identity risk, privacy, personal privacy, and also identity theft. There is systemic risk to our system. If you look at the Mirai botnet, which was last fall, we don't have to look farther than that to understand the impact that a relatively small volume of connected devices can have on the global internet, on the global economy. So it depends upon how you slice it. I would answer that question from a particular angle, I guess. Are we talking about critical infrastructure, health, transportation, where you are? There are a bucket of risk for all of them. I always feel compelled to say I don't think that we're facing the end of days because of this, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done.
So that attack was, I think it was last October. 2016. Did we learn anything from that? Or are we just sitting and waiting for another one?
I think we've made incremental progress. We definitely learned things. I don't know that we've incorporated the changes. Let's see as the next generation of devices come out. Next time you buy a device, if it has a default password and doesn't encourage or require you to change it, then you'll know that that manufacturer did not learn anything from this. But there are some who did. So that's the first easy test that we have to pass. Is no default, no hard-coded passwords. We shouldn't be saying this 20 years into connected devices, but we are.
Why? Why are we, what took so long?
Well, your second point about regulation and incentives, because there's not a lot of incentive not to do it right now. That if you look, it's an economic externality. The device was manufactured in far-off land, sold through intermediaries to someone maybe in the U.S., was misused by someone maybe in Europe to attack a U.S. company, but it was attacked from a device that was owned by me or someone in my house, and we never knew it was being used as an attack. And even if I did know, it still worked fine. So why did I care? I mean, how do you break into that chain to get some change to happen?
Quite a scenario. Hilary, from your point of view, from Toyota's point of view, what do you think are the big risks for IoT?
Well, obviously, looking at this from sort of an automotive perspective, I think, and I believe I fortunately missed it, but I believe Congresswoman Eshoo made some comment about a sort of car zombie apocalypse, which is sort of I think all of our worst case scenarios, right? So I mean, I think there's obviously legitimate security and privacy concerns around sort of connected and automated vehicles, but I don't think this is all just sort of a bad news story, right? So I think. And to Jeff's point, I mean, I do think in the automotive space, the sensitivity around cybersecurity and the risks associated with the technologies that we're bringing to the market is prevalent. I think that there is a heightened awareness, different than the scenario that Jeff just explained. There are really significant risks to individual companies in the automotive space if we were to put a vehicle out on the market that was hacked. I mean, a brand reputation. It's not sort of as distributed, as maybe Jeff was talking about. So the good news is I think there's a tremendous amount of work that's being done, a lot of awareness around this. I don't think anyone in the auto industry has their head in the sand about the risks here, and we're sort of embracing the challenges in front of us, as we embark into the future.
Chris, I'll let you weigh in.
Sure. So I'd say three different things. From a network service provider's perspective, the big issue that we're concerned about is what I would call the weaponization of IoT. So this is the concept of what happened with Mirai, where you can have low-cost, cheap commodity devices that have very little security on them that get taken over, and what they can do is they can leverage the entire broadband connection into someone's home. So if you think about the proliferation of devices combined with the increase in broadband speeds into people's homes, those two factors means we can start seeing distributed denial of service attacks that are of a scale we wouldn't have imagined 5 years ago. And I don't have charts in front of me, but there is data that shows that if you followed security in 2012, we started to see kind of large-scale DDoS attacks on the U.S. banks. Since then, now in 2017, the size of the DDoS attacks we're seeing today dwarf those attacks.
What was there something special about 2012?
Well, that's when we really started to see the uptick of the DDoS attacks on the financial institutions.
Okay. Do we know why? Why that year? Why wasn't it 2011, 13?
You want to get into the detail?
Public reporting.
There's public reporting on the. I guess there was it the Syrians or the Iranians?
Iranians.
The Iranians. So.
Public reporting.
Public, yes. It's been reported that they launched a lot of the attacks as a response to some of the sanctions that were imposed.
Okay. So continue.
But the size of the attacks then were much smaller than what we're seeing today. And if you look at some of the yesterday I did an event where my chief security officer spoke, and he showed a lot of graphs that kind of illustrate this. But the size of the attacks now are they're basically twice as big, 3 times as big as what we saw in 2012. So with DDoS attacks getting so big, there's always a concern that that will have an effect on the overall network and on our customers. So we spend a lot of our time trying to figure out how do we prevent DDoS attacks through different technologies we can build into the network. So that's probably the top issue, because that gets right to our core business, which is providing our services, right? There's also issues, I think, the other 2 things I would say there's the issue of industrial IoT. So we have you have a lot of situations in which enterprise businesses or industries are bringing IoT devices into their environment. So like you can go and buy a camcorder or some sort of device, whatever it is, a camera for your computer, or a connected, you name it, connected device. Bring it into your office, plug it into your office networking environment. And all of a sudden, you've just introduced a vulnerability into your entire corporate environment. So if you can imagine that type of scenario playing out in a industrial setting for a piece of critical infrastructure, there's a big concern about IoT in the critical infrastructure space. And then I think on the consumer side, you have the obvious issues of consumer privacy and whether devices can be used to hijack the consumer's broadband connection, like I mentioned, but also used as a backdoor to get into a consumer's network and gather information and all sorts of things there. So I think there's a lot of concerns up and down the spectrum, but the number 1 issue for us is probably the IoT, the weaponization side.
Privacy is an interesting issue, and I was talking to Hilary about this, because when I think of security, I also think about safety. And in Japan, there was a situation where you believe that probably couldn't take place in the United States because of privacy. And it was a situation that was actually supposed to help people in natural disasters. Will you share that story?
Yeah, in this horrific tsunami that happened a number of years ago in Japan, there was a situation where the government went to the automakers and asked them to turn on sort of vehicle tracking capability so they could figure out where people were making turns, U-turns on the road, which would give some indication of where there might have been some blockages or an inability to sort of get through a space. And so using that data, the government was then able to go in and sort of clear where people maybe were cut off from the rest of the country. And I do think, it's a really interesting example of where some of this connected technology was used to promote sort of a response to a natural disaster. And I'm fairly certain that something like that wouldn't be possible in the United States because of such legitimate concerns around privacy and consumers' privacy.
Just interesting, the way privacy can cut both ways.
Right, exactly.
Chris, you were on one of these panels, and you said something so interesting. It was back in May. You said attackers go to where the users are.
Yes.
So where are the users, and how are the attackers finding them?
Well, people are buying these devices, right? So
it's just straight up devices.
Well, not just the devices, but the concern is that there's these low-cost commodity devices. If you look at Mirai, a lot of those devices were manufactured overseas. I was saying yesterday that if you actually look at like the webcams that were getting affected, or some of these cameras, they are I guess DVRs, that type of equipment. They were literally manufactured in Chinese. The user manuals were written in Chinese, so they were clearly built overseas. And I think the big issue that we're worried about right now is that there could be intentional backdoors being placed in these devices where they're being distributed out, and effectively they're just kind of lying in wait. Where if an attacker, let's say it's a nation state or someone else, can then turn those on and weaponize them and turn them into a large attack vector. So, but that is the big issue that we're concerned about, and I think that's what the U.S. government's concerned about. In the executive order that President Trump issued earlier in the year, they talked about botnets and DDoS attacks and trying to take action on that. We just finished a report at the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council that's going to be finalized next week that talks about different things that the ecosystem can do on botnets. So there's a lot of concern around dealing with these kind of robots and how do we stop that environment.
Jeff, I know your company's had some success taking down the bad guys. I know it sounds so like
Yeah.
cowboy. But tell us a little bit about that, and just I want to hear more about that.
Some work on botnets, some work on ransomware, criminal frauds, and that is work in conjunction with FBI, governments around the world. We partner with law enforcement around the globe. I mean, the most, picking one out, I guess it was a year or so ago, this was an 8-year process working with law enforcement identifying a criminal gang based in Eastern Europe. We tracked them as they moved from eBay scams to ransomware to bank hijacking software, Zeus botnet. Working with Eastern European authorities, arrested 3 guys over there, extradited to the US. That is a long process. Mm-hmm. And you can look at that in one of 2 ways. Some of the feedback as well. There's 3 people out of however many, but there is a deterrence factor to doing that. And that flips into what I think the US government is doing with indictments last year. It was last year against the Chinese, mm-hmm. the PLA, and also against some Iranian individuals. On the one hand, they're not going to be extradited to the US. On the other hand, we've just limited their travel options. And if you are a low-level officer in a foreign military working on their cyber operations and your face appears on an FBI Most Wanted poster, the guy in the cubicle next to you is not going to be thrilled about doing that very much. So there is an element of deterrence there, but still not enough. Companies like mine, AT&T, we all work with the US government, with other governments, within proper privacy constraints, but it is an essential element of combating the bigger problem here. So we also, on the the WannaCry outbreak this spring, mm-hmm. that broke on Friday morning, Mother's Day weekend. It was a long weekend on the phone sharing telemetry with DHS, with the White House, with others, anticipating where that was going. And that was probably the best public-private partnership I've seen in the 7-8 years I've been doing that. It was a good give and take. Usually you give up to the government information and they nod and say thank you, and then you never hear from them. In this case, we were getting information back and doing joint analyses. So that was a really good opportunity on the fly. It was a part of why the U.S. wasn't impacted. I think good luck was a bigger part of it with WannaCry, but it was a part of it.
In describing that was very dramatic. What are the challenges for you and for, I guess, all of us to be able to have that happen more often? I mean, you said it was an 8-year process. It took so long. What are the challenges? Why does it take so long? Why is it so hard?
So if you're looking to prosecute someone, that's a lengthier process, evidentiary rules, working with the government. If you just want to work together, whether it's on the DDoS effort that Chris talked about, on WannaCry, I think it is muscle memory that we're now getting. That process worked in WannaCry because that afternoon I emailed 2 folks I knew in government who I'd worked with, said, hey, you guys want any input? And I figured they were overwhelmed, and to my great surprise, I got a response within minutes. 15 minutes later, we had a connection.
That's so interesting.
That was a
phone call.
Yeah, I almost, my weekend would have been better if they'd never replied. But that worked well on the fly. Now, if they were looking, I'm a lawyer, but I used to be one. How could you have used that to prosecute if they were to find the originators of WannaCry? I don't know, but the response part, I think, is easier to do quickly than the long-term prosecution part. And we are involved in other efforts that have been ongoing for a long time because it is making a case takes a lot of work, and you have to be very meticulous about it.
If I could just offer one comment.
Yeah, of course. Please jump in.
When we did the Instack report, we were briefed by CSIPs and the FBI and others, and one of the things that came out was that the incentives for prosecutors are not necessarily aligned with botnet takedowns. So what we saw in the discussion was that takedowns actually are somewhat effective, and I mean, the attackers migrate to the next thing, right? But at least temporarily, you can disrupt what they're doing. And so what we found is that most of the prosecutors are incented to prosecute, right? They're not incented to just initiate an activity and take down a botnet if they can't prosecute. And since a lot of the actors are based overseas, in particular countries haven't signed on to things like the Budapest Convention, so they aren't capable of being extradited and prosecuted, there's not a lot of an incentive for a prosecutor to spend a lot of time and build a case, as Jeff's talking about, and actually do something just for the sake of disrupting a botnet. So one of the recommendations we're making in that report is that there ought to be a realignment or reconsideration of those incentives so that prosecutors in the Justice Department actually there's more consistency in the approach, and they're incented to actually take more activity to disrupt, not just prosecute.
So if I could piggyback on this, I do think this is a fascinating conversation because one of the things that I do think where there is an opportunity in my sector, in the auto sector, is finding ways for sort of more collaboration and coordination with the government on these matters. I think that this is uncharted territory for a lot of folks in the auto industry, and going into a space where traditionally our relationship with the U.S. government has been one of regulator and regulatee, right, and not necessarily one of coordination and collaboration and figuring out how our industry can sort of find its way into a more collaborative relationship on some of these cybersecurity or security privacy related issues, I think is one that's a challenge for us, and a challenge also for those in the U.S. government who are used to, treating us as a regulated entity, and So anyway,
why is that a challenge for you?
It's a challenge because so we're and I think this is not just for the auto industry. This is for any sort of heavily regulated industry, whether we're talking about medical devices and the relationship with the FDA. There are parts of the U.S. government that are open. That where we could foster sort of these collaborative and relationships. There are other parts of the government, those that regulate us, where that hasn't necessarily always been the case, right? And trying to figure out how to focus on these agencies where collaboration and coordination are sort of part of their mission, and less on sort of the regulatee relationship.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to take questions from the audience. I'm going to lighten this up just for a minute here, because the gloom and doom is bumming me out.
Right.
There was this great article called "The Internet of Things Has Turned on Me Big Time." Dear Diary, I'm writing by the light of a candle with a pencil in the bathroom. I have to sit here in the dark. You see, the Internet of Things is driving me mad out of my mind. The appliances in my home are ruining me, sliming me. They bully me. The washing machine emailed me. I know what you and the boys did last night. Spaghetti and Chianti again. The television in the bedroom tweeted, you're cut off. No more binge watching Married with Children. I tried to reach out to the appliances to make peace with them. I've pleaded with the smart meter in the kitchen. Can't we just get along? After all, we all live in the same house. So this is obviously a funny way of talking about taking humans out of the equation. And I'm interested in what you think is the effect of taking humans out of the equation on security. Given you just said a phone call helped lead to a takedown.
I think we don't know is the problem, because you have connected devices that are, based on their design, are making connections with other devices that were never envisioned by either manufacturer. And that's go back several years to an earlier NSTAC report on, I think we were calling it the industrial internet, then Internet of Things. One of the things that we put in that report was concern that you're going to have a web of connections leading and decision trees, overlapping decision trees within these devices, doing things that you don't know about. So the answer is I don't know. But it also leads to, your article had me thinking about one of the points I often make when I talk about this, is that just because you can connect something doesn't mean you should connect it. And just because you buy a connected device doesn't mean it has to be connected. My wife bought a car that you could start remotely, and I asked her, are you ever going to do this? And she said no. So we shut it off, because if she was never going to do it, I wanted to make sure that no one else was going to do it. If you can buy a not connected toaster, that's the one you should buy, unless you have a specific need for the, turn the toaster on from the road. So.
I'm
curious for you, Hilary, because humans are the ones driving cars.
Yeah, no, but just to draw on that, I mean, I think in the auto space, we need to differentiate, I think, very much between those features that are being offered for sort of convenience purposes, the remote start of your car, versus what I think is motivating a lot of us, which is the safety. Way too many people die in car crashes in this country and around the world every year. And there's something that we can do about that. And that is going to require automation and connectivity. And so, the trade-offs, I think, are quite different when you're talking about remote starting your vehicle versus preventing tens of thousands of people from dying on the roads each year, right? So, but to your question about, the whole point of what we do as an industry is to move people from one point to another point. So the person's always, the person remains sort of central to the equation. I don't see that changing at any point.
That is such an important point, though, and I say this as the security vendor. We cannot get so obsessed with security that it prevents us from deploying technologies that are going to either prevent accidents or in healthcare devices that are going to save a lot of lives because of a hypothetical. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do security, but there is always a trade-off, and I don't want us to swing too far to that security pendulum where we're not even thinking about the benefits that we're getting to society.
All right, let's see, do we have questions from the audience? No, yes? How did you feel about the human question, Chris? We didn't let you get in there.
Well, I think when it comes to security itself, there's obviously a movement towards automated security, but right now there is definitely still a human component in that. I mean, whenever we talk about doing things on the network on security, there's still people out there that have to validate and authenticate what we're going to do. We wouldn't just do something that we didn't have any kind of human involvement in at this point. The interesting thing will be when AI gets developed and whether that can take over the role what a human can do and whether security can become fully automated. There's clearly a desire to go to automation and machine learning so that we can do things a lot quicker in the security space, but I think that's going to take some time to evolve. But as it stands right now, the phone call, we got the similar phone calls when WannaCry happened, so I think that's still a lot of what happens right now. But over time, it's going to continue to evolve.
Before we wrap up, I want to let each of you take an opportunity. If there's something that we haven't covered that you think is important about this issue? What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important point I think people should take away is that this is not hopeless. You are not helpless. There are things you can do to secure your devices, to secure your accounts, to secure your digital identity. And when I hear the cascading stories about horrible things happening, I worry that people are just going to say, hell with it, I'm done. I can't do anything. And that's what the criminals are counting on. There is a lot one can do to make oneself very secure. So don't get discouraged.
How about for you, Hilary?
Yeah, earlier I mentioned that there's a lot being done in the auto industry. Maybe just to get into some of the specifics quickly. So in advance of there ever having been a real-world attack, sort of non-security research type attack on a vehicle, the auto industry came together and we decided to form an auto ISAC, an information sharing entity, so that we could start to share threats and vulnerability information amongst ourselves. We're very proud of being proactive in doing that. And that ISAC now is in the process of developing automotive cybersecurity best practices that each of us can use to sort of benchmark against and work to sort of advance the state of the art within our own company. And all of this is being done, to my earlier point, as an attempt to sort of get ahead of this, to be proactive in this, to not wait until something horrible happens in the real world to then try to move the ball forward.
And Chris, I'll give you the last word.
So I think if you think about IoT security, I think we're at a critical inflection point for IoT. So if you look at what happened with under President Obama when he issued the executive order that led to the NIST cybersecurity framework, that was around 2013, there was a lot of concern about enterprise security. I think we're at a very similar inflection point in IoT, that something needs to be done, and there needs to be a greater sense of urgency to do something to deal with these devices that are out there. And so that doesn't mean that we need to have government step in and regulate right now. But I think that the industry, there is pressure on industry to step up and actually build in some level of security in the devices. And so that's one of the things that we talk about in the Instack report, that each part of the ecosystem, whether it's the device makers, whether it's the network service providers, whether it's the application developers, there needs to be better security best practices built in up and down the ecosystem so that we can deal with some of these things. And I think that's something that we're all acknowledging. There's a lot of discussion about how to move that forward. So short of regulation, I think the industry has to step up and deal with some of these issues. I think they are moving in that direction. Clearly, the automakers are, but it's going to be an ongoing. Security is not an end state. You don't become secure. It's just a constant due diligence and management issue. But we have to continually evolve and be updating those standards. And the last thing I'll say is that the ecosystem, it includes everyone has a role to play. Consumers have a role to play, but we also can't rely entirely on the consumers. I mean, maybe I'm a skeptic, but I think people, if you give somebody the option to plug something in, they will just because they can. Yeah. And so at the end of the day, people are going to buy these devices because they can. And so we're not going to stop the flood of devices being out there. And so, and the idea that we can get all the consumers, fully educated to protect themselves, we've been trying that for a long time. It's super complicated and difficult to do. So while consumers have a role to play and there's tips and advice you can give them on how to be secure, at the end of the day, the industry also has to provide solutions that can help deal with the issue, completely abstract from the user.
Well, this is to be continued, but not right now. Thank you so much. Thanks to our panel.
Thank you.